So, welcome to Mr. Reed's PowerPoint, Topic A, the Medieval Church. We will try to get started here with the start of the slideshow presentation. I think it might be easier just to use the slides themselves instead of being in a format of presentation. This might ease the use of uh, understanding and might get the point across a little bit better. First, we start off with the title, the medieval church. Now, this medieval church, of course, is going to gain power during the Roman Empire. As we all know, the Romans were responsible for Christianity growing. And after the fall of Rome, what happens is the church itself becomes or fills the gap of power. And what I mean by that is that prior to Rome's fall, of course, the Roman territories were controlled by the armies and the state of Rome. After the fall, there are several Germanic tribes, the Huns, uh, the Vandals on the North African coast, who were attempting to take over part of the former Roman Empire. Here we have the exchange now taking place where it is the church who will take over as the greatest power during this period. So it is the Roman Catholic Church that is responsible for dominating medieval life. Okay? And we say this due to a number of different things. They controlled basically all aspects of those living within the bounds of Christendom. Now, Christendom is a word that is sometimes used to describe all those who live in an area that is occupied by mostly Christians. And we're going to use the map in the next slide to show you exactly what we mean by Christendom. And of course, in controlling the lives, we have to give specifics, which we will do in just a moment. Before we do, there are a few things that we need to make clear. Number one, that by controlling this entire region of basically most of Western and some of Central Europe, they are able to, that is, the church is able to have a huge amount of power and influence over those living within this region. So that is going to lead to a number of downfalls. Remember, the church is run by men. Men who, like all of us, have downfalls. And whenever humans are involved, there are going to be questionable actions taken. What I mean by that specifically is the Inquisition, and we will talk about that. It does, unfortunately, represent a unpopular time during the role of the Catholic Church, but it is something that we must be aware of. Now, speaking of daily life, what does it mean that daily life revolved around the church? Well, we have to ask ourselves why, during this period, why were people so desperate that they needed some sort of greater power? What were the reasons that led people to look for something else? Remember their livelihood, okay? They had a lifespan of not much more than 40 years. They lived in a period of extreme violence. Many of them tried to farm the land without much understanding of farming in general. And in fact, they perhaps even knew less than the first farmers who came in and started the farming or agricultural revolution we now refer to as the Neolithic Revolution. How did daily life revolve around the church? The church, in any particular manner, any particular village, was the center point, the church itself. And of course, in that being that center point, there was the idea that the, pardon me, the church being the center point would be the ideal place for celebrations of all kinds. What types of things we said in class? Weddings, funerals, the sacraments, okay? All those types of things were seen as celebration. And remember, we asked this question, why? Why would people get involved? Because they needed something to get beyond their particular uh, lives that they led. They wanted to look to the life after, okay, or the afterlife. And of course, for that, we say they looked to heaven. Although the church is more definitive about how one can get to heaven. But it is very important to point out two things. Christians during this period the only way that they could get to heaven was through the Roman Catholic Church. Okay? Um, they had to abide by the rules and regulations of the church that are mentioned in the textbook. They had to attend services. They had to give part of their money or tithe. They had to abide by certain rules that the church put forth, such as fasting, such as avoiding meats on certain days. That was to um, combine the people together, and in some ways the rules were written for other reasons which we will not get into today. One last thing to point out is that women were seen as weaker than men. By that we mean they were not given the same rights, for example the right to own property. They were not given the right to own a business. They were not given the right to divorce till much later. So they are seen and given less rights, yet the virginity of a female was held in high esteem. and that was respected above many other things. So, second slide complete. If we move to the third, we see the spread of Christianity here, and we see it is spread to Scandinavia, to Norway, as far north. It has spread to Russia, okay, and these little crosses, as you can see, indicate monasteries or perhaps convents. So this whole entire region that I am trying to point out here, okay, this entire area, okay, and of course the Italian peninsula is part of what I said was Christendom, okay? Very important to point out. Now, by 1050 AD, Muslim traders and warriors will take over this land that, if you remember, was formerly occupied by the Romans. Uh, and there was a stronghold of Christianity in Alexandria, Egypt at one time, but later it becomes part of the Muslim empire. Okay, I want you to be able to answer these questions here, 1 and 2, on your own. So make sure you have the understanding of that. Moving to slide 4. This image in slide 4 is, of course, entitled A Cardinal with His Bishops. And the cardinal here uh, is um, unknown, but I ask you to look at the dress, meaning the clothing, as well as the portrait itself. What do you see? What stands out? We will review this, but take a look, let's say, at this piece here. Take a look at the fine creation of his vestments. Look at the way in which uh, the I guess the bishops look to him in terms of um, the gaze upon him. Note the items on the table. Okay, everything is important. Everything tells a story. Moving on to, and by papal authority, we will see how the Pope and the Church intend to control most of Europe. Moving on to slide number 5. One of the biggest reasons why Christianity was able to take such a stronghold of Europe at this time, we'll say from the 5th century to about the 11th century, um, and even really beyond. So 6th, and then we're just going to arrow beyond, were the creation of monasteries and convents. Monasteries being for men, convents, of course, being for women. Now, why, once again, do you think people would want to give up their freedom, essentially, and join a monastery or join a convent? What was the connection? What was the aspects of life that people were drawn to? And uh, you might say in response, well, it was a way to get out of the violence and uncertainty that existed for most during this period. Um, Monks and nuns were, of course, Uh, they did work very hard, but they were, for the most part, under the protection of the church and local rulers. Okay, this is very important. They were able to do the many things that were listed. So you need to read and find out what the role or roles of these monasteries and convents were. Um, they are larger than what is listed here, but by and large, you need to come to an understanding of the importance of these monasteries and how well the buildings themselves were built, and some are still standing today. It is also important to point out that one Saint Benedict is going to create and write down rules to regulate monastic life. Monastic life offered a structured lifestyle surrounding prayer, surrounding perhaps time for chanting, surrounding also time for work in the fields. There were some who went into other services like pottery making and or uh, the brewing of wine and beer. So very informational. They offered health and education to the nearby areas, and they also offered lodging for pilgrims on the way to the Holy Land. Now, this figures in largely because it is the pilgrims who make their trip by land, mostly, to the Holy Land that is going to spur, in part, the Crusades. We will talk about that later. Finally, the monasteries are important because they housed or maintained scribes. I think we all know the importance of scribes by now. And they housed libraries that housed the Greek and Roman works. Okay, so the works of who do you think would be most important? Perhaps Aristotle, perhaps Cicero. He's a Roman writer. They were the ones who were able to write down and recopy the manuscripts that then were rediscovered during a period we call the Renaissance. Just to give you an example of the different types of monasteries, so this would be an image here. We see the image of a monastery made probably mostly out of stone, um, but see how it is largely unprotected because monasteries were respected. The security of monasteries was a general idea amongst all during this period, at least within Christendom. Okay, so they're going to be uh, protected by the kings and protected by the church. But look at, the large buildings that they created. There would be farms outside of this particular image. They would store their grains, perhaps within or without. And here we see an actual monastery, okay, and very simple, yet large and telling as to what exactly they did. The church would be at the center, perhaps. We see right here and right here of the monastery to make it clear that that was the reason for people being there. Very important. But we get a sense of the role of churches and monasteries throughout Europe during this particular period. Next, the church will grow in power. We will see how over a series of the smaller kingdoms, they are going to vie for more of the power that the church controlled. Okay? Uh, but for the early part of the Middle Ages, now we said about the 5th century to about the 10th century, 11th century, okay? The popes of the medieval period are going to claim papal supremacy, and they're going to rule over the kingdoms. So the Pope will rule under or over, excuse me, the kingdoms that we have talked about. Kingdoms such as Charlemagne, and there are several others. But during this period, the Pope is and the Church is going to involve itself in secular matters. Okay, in other words, rules and things dealing with the state. So some historians might say that they are over taking over too much power or trying to take over too much power. And the way that they were able to do this, remember, the church was the power that the people turned to. The church developed canon law, which is its own bodies of laws in terms of interpreting scripture and then making laws for the people in Christendom to follow. And the church was able to hold any of these leaders, these monarchs, in check uh, because they could issue the power of either excommunication of a particular ruler or an individual, or the power of interdiction, both of which were extremely uh, forceful measures to keep secular rulers in line with the church's teachings. Excommunication is uh, taking away the right of a person to attain the glories of heaven. So if you were excommunicated, the church said you would not be able to enter into heaven, which was obviously a big deal. Now that was placed usually on one individual, let's say one monarch who went out of line. We will look at some specific developments and some specific ideas. An interdiction is a little different. An interdiction is when the Pope stated that a ruler has stepped out of line, and for a period of time, there could be no celebration of the sacraments within that particular period. Okay, so this would be placed on a particular region or kingdom, and it kept the individuals from uh, um, being able to have weddings, baptisms, uh, any sort of church celebration. And remember, back up to one of the first slides, the people surround themselves around the idea of the church, and it's very important to them to belong to this church. So um, something like an interdiction would be very detrimental to the people. Anyone perhaps who died during this period would not have the ability to go to heaven because they wouldn't have the ability to have a funeral mass. So this brings up a number of concerns of the growing power, okay, the escalating power of the church during this particular period of medieval Europe. And it really extends um, until what we call the Reformation. And we will pick up there later. Finally, the slide at the end is simply a way for you to sort of organize your thoughts. And of course, we can highlight the medieval church, and there's certainly different things that you want to be thinking about during this period. Um, we will talk more about let's say, the Jews and Muslims in medieval Europe uh, when we go on and talk about the Inquisition and how Jews were treated during this period. But by and large, this is a good sort of web to allow you some understanding. So thank you very much, and we will look at some more specific uh, sources in class.